Imagine this for a moment. A man who doesn't rely on loud words or forced confidence, but instead carries a quiet, grounded presence that seems to shift the entire energy of a room the moment he enters it. And without even trying, women feel something different around him, something steady, something calming, something undeniably attractive that they cannot fully explain. And the surprising truth is that this effect often begins not in public, not in conversations, but in the most private hours of the night when no one is watching and when the body is quietly resetting itself for the next day. There is a simple nighttime oil routine, often overlooked and rarely discussed, that connects deeply with how a man feels in his own body, how he relaxes his nervous system, how his circulation improves, and how his natural masculine presence becomes more noticeable without any effort. And this is not about magic or manipulation, but about biology, rhythm, touch, and self-care that speaks directly to the subconscious signals that both men and women respond to on an instinctive level. When we talk about attraction in the context of intimacy and relationships, we often assume it begins with appearance or words. But female psychology can consistently show something deeper at play, something tied to emotional safety, physical grounding, and energetic consistency. And this is where nighttime routines matter more than most people realize, because the body carries stress from the day. Tension builds silently in the shoulders. The chest tightens without awareness, and the nervous system stays in a low-level state of alert that subtly dulls presence, reduces confidence, and weakens that natural masculine calm that is so often associated with attraction. The nighttime oil routine is not just about applying oil to the skin. It is about creating a ritual of reconnection with the body, especially areas like the chest, neck, shoulders, hands, and even the lower abdomen, where tension accumulates and where relaxation signals the brain that it is safe, that it can let go, and that it can restore balance. When a man slowly massages warm oil into his skin before sleep, using steady, intentional movements rather than rushed or mechanical gestures, something important begins to shift internally. Circulation improves, muscle tension softens, and the parasympathetic nervous system begins to activate, which is the state responsible for deep rest, recovery, and hormonal balance. Over time, this simple practice can influence how a man carries himself during the day, because better rest leads to improved testosterone regulation, improved mood stability, and a calmer emotional baseline that women often perceive as emotional maturity or grounded masculinity, even if they cannot consciously identify why. In relationships and intimacy, what many people fail to understand is that attraction is not just created in moments of interaction, but is maintained through the energy a person consistently carries. And a man who sleeps deeply, who wakes with a relaxed body, and who has reduced internal stress naturally communicates a different kind of presence, one that feels safer, more stable, and more emotionally available without becoming passive or weak. The oils themselves also play a role, not in a mystical sense, but through their physiological and sensory effects, as natural oils such as sesame, almond or coconut oil can nourish the skin, improve tactile sensitivity, and create a grounding sensory experience that signals care and attention to the body. And when this is paired with slow breathing and mindful touch, it becomes a form of somatic regulation that many high-performance individuals unknowingly use to reset their nervous systems. This is where the connection to masculine attraction becomes interesting, Because true masculine energy, in psychological terms, is not about dominance or aggression, but about containment, emotional stability, and the ability to remain centered under internal and external pressure. And when a man practices nightly self-care rituals, like oil massage, he is essentially training his body to release stress instead of storing it, which over time changes his default emotional expression. Women are often highly attuned to subtle cues such as tension in the jaw, tightness in posture, breath rhythm, and micro-expressions that reflect internal states. And when those cues shift toward relaxation and confidence, attraction naturally increases because the nervous system of the observer feels less threat and more ease. It is important to understand that this is not about performing masculinity, but about restoring it to a natural baseline that modern stress often disrupts. And in that restoration lies a quiet kind of attractiveness that does not need validation or effort. Even the timing of this routine matters because nighttime is when the body processes emotional residue from the day, and when a man uses oil massage as a transition ritual between activity and rest, he is essentially telling his mind and body that the day is complete, allowing deeper sleep cycles to occur, which in turn supports hormonal health, energy restoration, and morning vitality. Over time, this becomes noticeable not just internally but externally, in how he speaks, how he listens, and how he responds in moments of intimacy. Because a regulated nervous system creates emotional space, and emotional space is one of the most attractive psychological states in relational dynamics. What makes this routine so rarely known is not that it is complex, but that it is simple enough to be ignored, yet powerful enough to influence long-term patterns of attraction, confidence, and presence. And as we go deeper into this topic, it becomes clear that the real transformation is not in the oil itself, but in the relationship a man builds with his own body before he even steps into the world each day. As this practice becomes part of a man's nightly rhythm, something subtle but deeply influential begins to unfold in the background of his psychology. Because repetition is what transforms behavior into identity, and identity is what ultimately shapes attraction in long-term relationships. What starts as a simple application of oil and a few minutes of slow, intentional touch gradually becomes a signal to the brain that self-care is not optional but foundational. And this shift matters more than most people realize, because the human nervous system is constantly learning what is normal through repetition. When a man consistently engages in a calming nighttime routine, his baseline state slowly recalibrates, and instead of carrying the fragmented energy of stress, distraction, and overstimulation into his sleep, he begins to enter rest in a more organized and grounded way. This has a direct impact on emotional stability, because sleep is not just physical recovery, it is also psychological processing. And when the body is in a relaxed state before sleep, the mind is more capable of integrating emotional experiences without leaving behind residual tension. Over time, this creates a noticeable difference in how a man reacts under pressure, how quickly he becomes overwhelmed, and how present he can remain in emotionally charged situations, especially within intimate dynamics, where emotional regulation often determines the quality of connection far more than words or intentions. In the context of attraction and female psychology, This internal shift is particularly important because many women do not respond to surface-level confidence alone, but to the deeper signals of safety, consistency, and emotional steadiness that a man unconsciously communicates. A man who is constantly tense, reactive, or internally restless may still appear confident on the surface, but the underlying nervous energy is often perceived on a subconscious level as unpredictability, whereas a man who is calm in his body tends to project a sense of reliability that is emotionally soothing. The nighttime oil routine, when practiced consistently, becomes one of those quiet tools that helps reduce internal noise, allowing a man to show up in relationships with less emotional fragmentation. This does not mean becoming passive or overly soft, but rather becoming internally organized, where emotions are felt without being overwhelming, and presence is maintained even in moments of tension or intimacy. That kind of emotional grounding is often interpreted as maturity, and maturity is one of the strongest psychological attractors in long-term relational dynamics. There is also a deeper layer connected to sensory awareness that begins to evolve through this practice. When a man engages in slow, deliberate touch with natural oil on his skin, he is not only relaxing muscles, but also reawakening sensory pathways that are often dulled by daily stress, screens, and constant mental stimulation. This heightened bodily awareness creates a more refined sense of embodiment, meaning he becomes more in tune with posture, breathing, and physical presence throughout the day. Women are often highly sensitive to embodied presence, noticing how a man occupies space, how grounded his movements are, and how relaxed or tense his physical expressions appear. A man who is more embodied tends to move with less unconscious tension, more ease, and more natural rhythm, and this contributes significantly to what is often described as masculine presence, not in a performative sense, but in a deeply rooted, biological sense of stability and self-possession. Another often overlooked aspect is the psychological association the brain builds around ritual. When a man repeats a calming nighttime routine, his mind begins to associate that sequence with safety and closure, which helps reduce internal resistance to rest. In modern life, many people go to sleep carrying unresolved stimulation, whether from digital exposure, emotional stress, or mental overactivity, and this fragmented transition into sleep often reduces sleep quality and recovery. By introducing a structured sensory ritual like oil massage, the mind receives a clear signal that the day is ending, allowing mental activity to slow down more naturally. This improves not only rest quality but also emotional reset, which can influence how a man interacts with his partner the following day, especially in moments that require patience, attentiveness, and emotional responsiveness. From a relational perspective, this becomes even more significant because intimacy is not sustained only through physical attraction, but through emotional rhythm between two people. When a man is internally regulated, he is less likely to project stress onto his partner, less likely to misinterpret emotional signals, and more capable of holding space during vulnerable moments. This kind of emotional availability is not about constant expression, but about stable presence, where a partner feels that she does not have to manage or decode instability in his mood. In many female psychological patterns, emotional safety is directly linked to attraction over time, because the nervous system naturally gravitates toward environments where tension is minimized and consistency is present. A man who unknowingly cultivates this through nightly self-regulation practices often finds that his relationships feel less chaotic and more deeply connected, not because he is trying harder, but because his internal world is becoming less fragmented. There is also an important connection between self-perception and external perception. How a man treats his body in private often shapes how he is perceived in public, even without direct visibility. When he invests time in caring for his body, even in small ways, his internal narrative begins to shift from neglect to respect, and this subtle change influences posture, eye contact, tone of voice, and overall confidence. Confidence, in this context, is not loud or forced but calm and embodied, emerging from a sense of internal alignment rather than external validation. This kind of confidence is particularly impactful in intimacy because it removes the need for performance and replaces it with authenticity, allowing interactions to feel more natural and less pressured. As this routine continues over weeks and months, the cumulative effect becomes more noticeable. Sleep becomes deeper, mornings feel less heavy, emotional reactions become less extreme, and a general sense of internal balance begins to stabilize. In relationships, this often translates into fewer misunderstandings, smoother communication, and a more stable emotional connection. What makes this transformation powerful is that it does not rely on external change, but on internal regulation, meaning the foundation of attraction becomes more sustainable rather than dependent on fluctuating moods or circumstances. And as this process continues, it becomes clear that what appears to be a simple nighttime oil routine is actually a form of self-recalibration that influences not just physical relaxation, but emotional intelligence, relational stability, and the quiet kind of masculine presence that often speaks louder than words ever could. As these internal shifts deepen, something even more subtle begins to emerge, and it is the way a man relates to desire itself, both his own and the energy that exists between him and a partner. When the body is constantly in a state of stress, desire often becomes fragmented, inconsistent, or overly dependent on external stimulation. But when the nervous system is regularly guided back into calm through practices like a nighttime oil routine, desire begins to stabilize rather than spike and crash. This stability does not reduce passion, it refines it, because the body is no longer chasing stimulation to compensate for fatigue or tension. Instead, arousal becomes more naturally connected to presence, emotional connection, and genuine closeness, which are the foundations of deeper intimacy in long-term relationships. In this state, attraction is no longer driven by urgency or pressure, but by a quiet, steady awareness of connection that feels more grounded and less performative. This is where female psychology becomes especially relevant, because in intimate relationships, many women are not simply responding to physical traits or surface confidence, but to the quality of emotional energy exchanged in close proximity. When a man is internally regulated, his presence tends to feel less intrusive and more inviting, creating a sense of emotional ease that allows a partner to relax more fully in his presence. That relaxation is not passive, it is deeply relational, because when the nervous system feels safe, emotional openness increases naturally. Over time, this creates a feedback loop in intimacy, where both partners feel more understood, less guarded, and more emotionally synchronized. A man who unknowingly supports this through consistent self-regulation practices like nighttime oil rituals often notices that conversations become smoother, physical closeness feels more natural, and emotional misunderstandings begin to decrease without any conscious effort to fix them. There is also an important dimension related to masculine identity that evolves through this kind of nightly discipline. In modern environments, masculinity is often misunderstood as external display, yet psychologically it is far more about internal containment, the ability to hold emotional pressure without becoming reactive or disconnected. When a man develops a habit of slowing down at night, reconnecting with his body, and releasing accumulated tension through intentional touch, he is essentially training his system to stop carrying unnecessary emotional weight forward. This creates a kind of internal clarity where reactions are less impulsive and responses are more deliberate. In relationships, this shift can be felt even if it is never explicitly discussed, because emotional safety is often communicated through consistency rather than explanation. Over time, this consistency begins to reshape how intimacy itself is experienced. Instead of intimacy being something that is entered only in moments of heightened emotion or physical drive, it becomes a natural extension of presence and emotional availability. This is where many relationships either deepen or remain superficial, because true intimacy requires a level of nervous system stability that allows both people to remain emotionally open without feeling overwhelmed. A man who is regularly grounded in his own body contributes significantly to this dynamic, because he becomes less likely to oscillate between emotional extremes and more capable of maintaining steady connection even during moments of vulnerability or disagreement. The nighttime oil routine also has a quieter but very real effect on self-perception, which is often underestimated in discussions about attraction. When a man consistently engages in caring, intentional touch toward his own body, it gradually reshapes the way he internally relates to himself. Instead of treating the body as something that is only pushed, stressed, or neglected, he begins to experience it as something that is worth attention, restoration, and respect. This shift influences self-esteem in a grounded way, not through inflated confidence, but through a stable sense of self-respect that does not depend on external validation. And in relational dynamics, this form of self-perception is often more attractive than any verbal expression of confidence, because it is reflected in behavior, posture, tone, and emotional steadiness. There is a deeper biological layer to this as well, because the nervous system responds strongly to repeated states of relaxation. When the body is consistently guided into a calm state before sleep, stress hormones gradually reduce their baseline activity over time, which supports better recovery, improved mood regulation, and more balanced energy throughout the day. This has a direct impact on how a man shows up in emotionally charged or intimate situations, because he is less likely to carry hidden fatigue or unresolved tension into those moments. Instead, there is a greater capacity for patience, attentiveness, and presence, all of which are qualities that significantly enhance emotional and physical intimacy. As these changes accumulate, relationships often begin to feel less like effort and more like flow. Misunderstandings do not disappear completely, but they lose their intensity because the emotional foundation becomes more stable. Physical attraction also evolves, becoming less about novelty and more about depth of connection. In many cases, partners begin to notice a subtle shift without being able to articulate it directly, often describing it as feeling more safe, more connected, or more understood, which are all reflections of nervous system harmony rather than surface-level change. This is the quiet power of internal regulation practices. They do not force change externally, but they transform the emotional atmosphere from within. In the broader sense, what this nighttime oil routine represents is not just a self-care habit, but a return to bodily awareness in a world that constantly pulls attention outward. It is a reminder that masculine presence is not built in moments of performance, but in moments of solitude, when a man is alone with his body and chooses not to ignore it but to care for it. That choice, repeated over time, becomes identity shaping. And identity, more than anything else, is what determines the kind of energy a person brings into intimacy, into relationships, and into every emotional exchange that follows. In conclusion, the true essence of this practice is not the oil itself, but the state it creates within the man who commits to it consistently. It builds regulation where there was tension, awareness where there was disconnection, and presence where there was fragmentation. And in the context of intimacy and attraction, those internal shifts are far more powerful than any external technique, because they shape how love is experienced, how desire is sustained, and how connection is felt at its deepest level. Over time, what begins as a simple nighttime ritual becomes something far more meaningful, a quiet foundation for emotional stability, relational depth, and a form of masculine presence that does not need to announce itself because it is already felt in silence.